Hello, everyone. I'll give people a few minutes to trickle in here, and then we will get started. All right, we'll give people a couple minutes to filter in, and we'll get started. All right, 30 more seconds, and we'll get started. I already have a question. Are we going to share the recording? And yes, we are going to share the recording. It'll go out in an email after the webinar is done. Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third annual Propeller Power Hour. My name is Nathan Smith. I'm a customer success engineer here at Propeller, and today we are going to be talking about problematic surfaces, and I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about water. So get used to that. So here's how we're going to do it. We're going to cover it basically in three steps. I'm going to give you a background on photogrammetry and LiDAR, which might explain why we have some problems with certain surfaces. Then we'll actually talk about specific surfaces and their effects on the data. And then we're going to talk about what you can do to fix or avoid collecting bad data. And finally, just like all the other power hours, we'll have a long session at the end for Q&A and discussion. So this is a good time to mention that we do have a Q&A function available. If you have a question for me that you want me to answer live and in person, then please put that in there, and I will do that after I'm done with the presentation. So I'll bring it up again at some point, but again, Q&A, questions, post, please. Appreciate it. Okay, first step, photogrammetry and LiDAR. By the way, there is no consensus on how to capitalize LiDAR. So we have LiDAR, 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 and LiDAR. But I'll start with photogrammetry, then we'll move into GigaChad LiDAR, and then we'll talk about the pros and cons of each one of them. So photogrammetry. This is the actual definition of photogrammetry. I pulled it off Wikipedia. It's very boring. I'm not going to read it. What is interesting about photogrammetry is that it was pioneered in 1859 by this colonel whose name I can't pronounce, so I'm not even going to try. And really, he laid down the actual principles in the 1898 research paper, this name that I also can't say, so I'm not going to try and butcher it. The interesting thing about this is that we actually have a lot of these principles in this paper that he wrote that are still used today when processing and dealing with photogrammetry data sets. Also, just a handsome dude. Here are the steps for photogrammetry, and I'm simplifying a lot of this, but basically, you find a target to capture, in this case, a house or a site. You fly around the site taking overlapping photos, overlapping important. You stitch these photos together using common features. We call them tie points or registration points to generate a single stitch together orthomosaic. Then if we want a 3D photo with elevations, we use reference features between each of those photos to generate the 3D model. And finally, we georeference the model using ground control points so that where you can place it on the Earth's surface in a real location. Finally, you enjoy your model. Now, steps 3 and 4 are where we're going to have a lot of the problems that we're going to talk about today. So just keep that in mind that we need tie points and reference features. As far as LiDARs go, LiDAR is actually an acronym like radar or scuba. It stands for light detection and ranging. And like almost everything, it derives from Cold War military experiments about dealing with laser rangefinders, which is why the first LiDAR you see in the top right there, which is technically a LiDAR unit, is basically an M14 stock with some lasers strapped onto it. So that was generated in built in 1962 at 11-kilometer range, the 4.5 meter accuracy as far as laser range finding goes. But the actual first LiDAR was in 1963, which is the SRI Mark I that you see on the right there. But again, very military looking thing. And I also don't know about having those computers out in the sun. I'm sure that was just publicity photo. There we go. I'm going to massively simplify the LiDAR process because I'm not smart enough to know what it is. And basically, the LiDAR works a lot like radar. Instead of bouncing radar or radio waves off of a target, it bounces a laser off of a target back to a sensor. And the way that this works for generating point clouds is that we know the speed of light as a constant, right? So we can derive the distance of an object by the time it takes for it to travel times the speed of light divided by 2. I'm not good at math. Again, math really simplified. One thing that's interesting about LiDAR is that it's able to quote unquote punch through vegetation. And it doesn't actually punch through vegetation. It doesn't actually pierce vegetation. It doesn't go through vegetation. What it does is it sends out so many pulses or signals that it gets around the vegetation to get some kind of a return on areas below the vegetation, as you can see in the diagram there. So we're getting fewer returns from bare earth, but it is getting through the vegetation to get them. Pros and cons of each. These are going to kind of be two halves of the same coin. So pro for photogrammetry is a cheaper sensor. They're basically just high quality cameras. You know, a lot of the drones flying around are using an RX1, R2 Sony camera, which you can just buy as a camera and use in your hands if you want to. Photogrammetry also tends to have faster flight times with a smaller amount of data, which means that the processing times are faster for photogrammetry data sets. And one thing I hear a lot when people ask me about LiDAR photogrammetry is photogrammetry as accurate as LiDAR? And the answer is yes, with the caveat that on surfaces without dense vegetation cover, it's either as accurate or even more accurate than the LiDAR data set from that same area. Problem is that it needs to have a relatively clear shot of the site. The other thing is that you're not locked into processing software with photogrammetry. Obviously, we'd prefer you use Propeller and give us money because that's how I get paid. But you're not forced to do that. There's a lot of options out there. The cons, I mean, like I said, it's tough to get bare earth through dense vegetation. I'm talking about like tree canopies, high grassland, stuff like that. Basically, what the camera sees is what you get, or what the signal. The other problem, and this is the one we're going to talk about a lot, is that we can't stitch featureless areas together. And it's really tough to model complicated targets. When I'm talking about complicated targets, I'm talking about pipe work, lattice work, beams, support, or suspension bridges, crane arms, stuff like that. As far as LiDAR goes, like I said, kind of on the other half of this, you can model those more intricate models much easier uh, because it is just using a laser rather than like a flat image to model it. You are able to get returns off of every single piece of the feature you're trying to collect. Like I said, it also quote unquote pierces vegetation, which isn't true, but is true for the most part. And when it does so, we actually classify the ground and not ground points so that you can just remove all of the not ground points from the model to see the bare earth. The other thing, and this is becoming more and more common, is that there are a multiple amount of ways to capture LiDAR. Tripod units, truck units, handheld devices, mounted on an airplane, mounted on a drone, on a helicopter, all that kind of stuff. Now the downside, LiDAR sensors get very expensive very quickly. So if you want to get a good high-end drone LiDAR, you're looking at probably 100 grand-ish. If you want to get a good pickup mounted LiDAR unit, you're looking at 500,000 to $1 million-ish. So keep that in mind. The other half of this is that a lot of manufacturers want to keep charging you for a software subscription. So what they do is they export the point clouds in proprietary formats that can only be read by their software. And they all do this, but a couple examples are, Yellowscan, Cloud Station, DJI Terra, so on and so forth. The other problem is that depending on how many or how big your data set is and how dense you have your data collection set, the amount of data that you capture can actually be overwhelming, which means that your processing times can be really long depending on how much data that you've captured. Okay, part two, moving on to surfaces. So we have two different types of surfaces that give us a lot of problems here. And again, if you have questions, please post them in that Q&A section, and I will answer them when I can. So our two types of surfaces are uniform surfaces, meaning that they have a lack of distinguishing features, and reflective surfaces. And unfortunately, water falls into both of these. We're going to talk a lot about water. So uniform surfaces, this is mostly a photogrammetry issue, because if we don't have features in each photo to use as those tie points that I talked about earlier, we're unable to stitch the photos together into a single orthomosaic. And this becomes a big problem when it takes up the entirety of the field of view of the camera. So What you see on the right side here is a lake, and near the shoreline and near the trees and things like that, we're able to stitch it together. But as soon as it goes out into the center of the lake and you only start seeing water in the picture, we end up with these big holes in the model because we're just not able to use those photos to stitch them together. The first thing I want to bring up is asphalt. A lot of people don't think about this, but basically the freshest asphalt is actually pretty tough to capture data-wise. It doesn't help that it's black, and so it's pretty tough to figure out like waves and things in the asphalt without like introducing bad data. And this problem tends to kind of fix itself over time. So as if you lay down a fresh asphalt pad, it's black, it's shiny, all this other stuff. Over time, people start using it. They drive on it, they put signs in it, they paint lines in it for like parking lots or for road markings. And even cracks and potholes over time are useful as registration points. So what I have here are two pictures of the same pad about 8 days apart. So I believe the pad was laid down on August 13th. So 2 days later, they flew it and it already had a couple of marks on it. And then you see 8 days later, it got all this stuff on it. And this makes it much, much easier to model from a photogrammetry perspective. Like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about water a lot. The problem with water is that whether water is calm, whether it's choppy, whether it's blue, whether it's green, whether it's whatever, you're going to run into a lot of the same problems. So for photogrammetry specifically, we're dealing with an issue where we can't find tie points, like I mentioned. Now, this one you see in the top right, again, we just cut the edge of the shore there. So we can use those rocks and things to use as tie points. But if we go farther out into the lake, we're going to lose it. The other thing that we could use are like anchored buoys or paths, but we need to make sure they don't shift between photos, which is kind of a problem. The third surface we're going to talk about is sand. And when I'm talking about sand, I'm not talking about like sand with rocks and scrub brush and stuff in it. I'm talking about flat, featureless, Sahara style sand. You may also notice that over time, this kind of flat sand gets these little ripples or dunes in it, and I'm talking very, very tiny ripples. Those don't really help because they're all kind of the same, and they're all really tough to pick out photo to photo. And this is obviously going to be a problem in certain areas of the country or the way you have your site set up. In the US Southwest, if you're working in the desert, if you're working on the tidal flat, if you're working on the salt pan, if you're working on Arrakis, all this other stuff. A couple examples here. So these are both from the same site, and this is a site in Texas. And on the left side, we have good, and the right side, we have, yeah. So on the left side, you see that we have a lot of features available. We have tire tracks, we have a conveyor, we have equipment, we have pipe work, we have a car, we have all this other stuff, front loader. You can use all of those things to stitch the photos together because they are discrete features of each one. On the right side, we have a line of something and one little tiny sagebrush. So if this is all that the camera is going to see, we're going to run into problems with this. Last surface I want to talk about is vegetation. A lot of people don't think about this. And like I mentioned earlier, when I mention vegetation, I'm talking about dense tree canopies or high grasslands that obscures the entire ground surface. The biggest problem comes with wind because as the drone is flying, a gust of wind comes up, it causes all the canopy leaves to move around. And then it turns out that trying to pick out an individual leaf in photos from altitude is really, really tough. So just like the water around the edges of this grove, we're able to stitch together using these features like the road and things like that. Once you get over the trees and that's all you see, big hole in the model. So keep that in mind when you're flying. And again, that's only going to be prevalent in certain areas or certain sites. Obviously, if you're doing a grubbed site, you're not going to run into this problem. Okay, second surfaces, and we're going to talk about reflective/clear surfaces here. This is a problem for both LiDAR and photogrammetry. So part of the issue with these surfaces, I'm going to talk about this again, and this is mostly water focused, is that either the light will bounce off the surface or it actually sees through the surface and penetrates too far and gives you a false base. So what happens is you end up with these kind of goofy looking features in your model. So this one on the right here is a creek or river or waterway or whatever. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure that water doesn't just rise in the middle of a river for no reason, like you're showing here. So you end up with these weird spikes, valleys, hills, whatever else. The good news is that if you're not flying water, this is relatively rare. So again, we're going to talk about the water. The one exception to that is snow and ice. And when I'm talking snow and ice, I'm talking about very, very clean, fresh snow or ice, usually in direct sunlight. So The problem here is that if you fly ice, first of all, you don't want to be out there because it's usually too cold to fly. But when the sun is reflecting off of it, you just end up with a glare off of the ice. And it obscures a lot of the features on the ice because the camera is just getting glare back at it. The problem with snow is that it just covers everything up. The good news here is that the unless the snow is really, really deep and really, really fresh, you're going to see something through it. On the bottom one here, you can see it's been, a day or so since the last snowfall. You have a snowmobile track, you have a plowed mark, you can see the trees coming up out of it. So this is normally only going to be a problem when you have like a flat graded or native ground site with no large vegetation or features on it, and it just gets covered in snow. And this is actually an instance like with asphalt, where the longer you leave it, the better it gets because the disturbances help pick out features in the snow. Back to water. Again, multiple problems. So if the water is still, it can cause the sensor to see through it and actually hit whatever is underneath it and return that as a ground surface, which is not true. If it's rough, it can cause water to bounce or cause the light or laser to bounce off at goofy angles. So what you end up with are these spikes, like you see here. This is literally the laser bouncing off of the water and returning or giving a false return to the unit. So basically, whenever you see a water surface in a photogrammetry or LiDAR data set, it's safe to assume that there are problems here until you're proven otherwise. Like on the right side here, this is a river, and I'm pretty sure rivers don't have a dip in their water surface that goes up to the bank. The water eats the bank, it eats the shoreline. That's what water does. And you can look at this if you like tilt your view and look at it from a different angle, but also you can use the tools inside the Propeller platform to help out with that, to help you visualize things, specifically the cross section and the gradient map tools. And I have an example here. These are all the same data set. These are all the same view of the same data set. So this is the same exact area all three times. So we have the original view straight down over a green lake. Not great. If you're really attentive, you may notice that there are some lines and things in the water that you can see. There's one in the top right, but otherwise pretty featureless. But if I draw my cross section across it, you see that we start ending up with these weird little rises, these little mesas and things in the water, which isn't great. So that's your first clue that something is going wrong. Going to the gradient map, and for those of you who don't know, a gradient map is basically a measure of slope across your site. So anything that isn't colored is considered an area of no slope. Anything that's green is considered like 0 to 30-degree slope. Yellow is 30 to 70-ish. And purple and red are 90 and above, which is almost impossible. So just basically consider purple and red to be vertical. And again, as you see here, a lot of issues going on with this water surface that don't become readily apparent. So just some visualization tools to help you figure it out. And you can find the gradient map underneath the survey tab in the platform. So what do we do about it? There's four things we can do about it. First of all, we can change our mission planning. We can try to use automatic filters. We can use turning cleanups or manual cleaning. And basically where not to measure is kind of a big deal. And before I go into these, once again, if you have questions for me or just want to chat, post them in the Q&A section in Zoom, please. So the first one is mission planning, and this is probably the easiest way to fix this. So what you are looking at is changing your mission settings so that you are either avoiding problematic areas or you are including features in those areas between each of the photos here. So what you see, especially on the right side, is that you'll notice one of the transects kind of goes over the middle of the lake here, but it's going to be able to see the shoreline on either side of it. It's not a very big lake. But because it will be able to see the shoreline on either side of the photos, we have something to tie the photos together. So the three easiest settings here are the mission angle, like I said here, where they're going, they're cross-hatching the lake, basically. The altitude, because as you increase the altitude, the camera's field of view actually increases as well. And so it's able to capture more information and possibly pick up something to use between photo to photo. The other thing is your mission area. If you have a large body of water on site, but you don't actually care about it that much, just change your mission area to exclude the body of water, or only fly around the shoreline and exclude the center of the water area that you don't care about. So that requires kind of knowing your site, but even looking at it from an aerial, you can tell, okay, that's a body of water, that's a huge sand dune, stuff like that. And you might be able to avoid those areas. One other thing you can do is kind of fly when shadows are present. to highlight terrain differences. And this is specifically dealing with like water and snow. So if you're flying when the sun is directly overhead, obviously it's pointing straight down at your feature and it's not able to cast a shadow on either side of it. But if you fly, say, a few hours before or a few hours after high noon, that sun comes at it from a different angle and casts a shadow that we can use to pick out features on landscape. Again, this is something I only recommend when you know that the surface is going to be problematic. Otherwise, we normally recommend flying when the sun is directly overhead. If you have a hard surface, the last resort here is to make your own tie marks and paintings and stuff on it. That I don't normally recommend because it's going to take a long time and you're going to need a lot of them. So if you're not already planning to mark out like a parking lot or something like that, maybe try to fix it doing something else before you do that. That's more of a desperation. Second, we have our automatic filters. And these, if you've uploaded data sets, these look pretty familiar to you. But these are filters that are chosen at upload, and based on how aggressive a filter you choose, they try to remove features that don't correspond with the area around it. So cars, pickups, vehicles, trees, stuff like that. This is an automatic process, and we name them based on what they normally remove from the model. Equipment and vegetation and structures, and everything, which does exactly what it says, just flattens the entire site down to nothing. These work sometimes, but always double check your data. Don't rely on them blindly if you can help it. Third thing we can do is terrain cleanup. So this is where we're actually cleaning up the terrain on our own and drawing in the cleanups. So this is really great for water, but it basically can drastically reduce these distortions on areas that you know are problematic. Downside is that it requires you to manually check the data and actually draw in the terrain cleanup. But this is fantastic for water because what you can do is you can use either the banks or the shoreline as your reference level, and it'll flatten the entire water surface to that bank or shoreline, which is how water works. One of the other nice things is that if you are flying the same mission over and over again, you can actually copy one terrain cleanup from one data set to another. So if you're flying the exact same area and you know that the problem area is going to be the same spot every single time, you draw the terrain cleanup on one data set and you just keep copying it from data set to data set. Super handy. One thing to be careful of is that the terrain cleanups is extremely aggressive when it comes to flattening. You'll see here that I basically sliced this building in half, and it's trying to generate a surface with the fewest number of triangles possible. And because I drew a square-ish rhombus trapezoid looking thing, it used 2 triangles, and that's the lowest number you can get for this kind of a square. So it will remove stockpiles. It will remove any feature you tell it to. So just be careful about that. And I have an example here. So what we have is a canal, and I'm relatively certain water doesn't do this in a canal, especially still water. So what happened is that near the edges, the light penetrated a little bit below the water. And then as the water gets deeper, it loses that soft ground and starts making the hill because the water, becomes darker, cloudier, returns better. And then as we get to the other bank, it does the same thing. So we end up with this kind of weird looking dune shape in our cross section here across the water. Now, if you go into terrain cleanups on the top left under the survey tab, you'll see the gradient map option there. And you draw in an area on this water surface using the banks as reference, it looks like this, which is how water is supposed to look. So what I've done is I basically used the very, very edge of the banks, or these slopes in this instance, as my guide to draw in the terrain cleanup. Again, I removed almost everything down to two triangles for a square, but we're ending up with a water surface that's much more appropriate to what we're expecting. There's a little bit of rise into it, and maybe that's because I didn't place the edges quite at the same spot on each bank. That's just me being not good. But for the most part, this is exactly what we want to see. We want to see this kind of flat surface, not this. This, not this. Camera 1, camera 2. Camera 1, camera 2. Good. Could do better. No, wait. Bad, could do better. Better. The last one of these is basically measurement avoidance. And this is more training for people that are using the platform. Just recognize where problematic areas are going to be and basically avoid them. So in this instance, we have a mine here with a pond in the center that they use for stuff. And knowing that water is going to cause you a problem, even if it's very opaque like this with a lot of algae growth, it's going to cause you problems, knowing that you should avoid that when you're doing your measurements. There's a couple ways you can do this. First of all, you can just tell people about it, send out an email, send out a memo, call someone up, say, hey, don't measure this area. That's going to give us bad data. Whatever. The other thing you can do is actually like put in measurement or point measurements or hazard points that say exactly where your terrain is problematic so that people know every time they look at the survey, that's where they're going to have issues. One thing that I personally like doing, this isn't technically necessary, but is that you note where your terrain cleanups are. And this is more for information transparency's sake, because you are manually editing a survey, which even though the survey came back with bad data, you are still editing that survey. And so it's just good to let people know that, hey, we edited this terrain, but it was for this reason, and this is why we did it. But it just increases information transparency, especially if you have like auditors looking at your job or public entities looking at your job or something like that. And they're like, hey, why does this look so goofy? You can go back and explain what's going on. So a little shorter than last time, but that gives us lots of times for questions and answers. So again, if you do have questions, please post them in the Q&A. I'll start going through them, and then we will go from there. So I'm going to stop this so you don't stare at that thing the whole time. Move this over so I can look at you. So we do have a couple of questions, not all of them related to surfaces, which is fine. I'm just going to go through them. With the new tin surface function, which we just emailed out about, using a rover, will we be able to build drill plans using Propeller? Kind of. That's an instance where I would have to look at the specific plan you're looking to get. If you're just looking to get like a CSV, if you're looking to get a tin surface, if you're looking to get just a series of points in a DXF file or something like that. My heart says yes, but that's a question that I would forward to your CSE or whoever is your support person at Propeller, and then kind of help you out with the specific use case there. Next, what is the solution to uniform surface photogrammetry? We have a lot of snow cover aggregate piles that need stockpiles measured regularly. The good news with aggregate pits, we have snow cover aggregate pits. The good news with aggregate pits is that because they are by definition not flat, we usually don't have a problem with snow in those kind of an instance, unless it is incredibly deep, incredibly fresh snow that you're flying in the middle of the day. So what I would do first is, before you get too aggressive with it, is try to fly the site, see what it looks like. If you notice problems with it, then go back and start doing the things we talked about, cleaning it up manually, making sure that you're capturing edges of the pits or the stockpiles so that we have some kind of a contrast against the top of the piles, things like that. But generally, like I said, that's a problem that solves itself, because as the snow melts or you start adding more material on top of the snow, the disturbances end up generating these tie points. Question: can we get a copy of this PowerPoint? I want to say yes, but I will ask my handlers. But we should be able to send one out with the recording as well. Does changing your altitude help with uniform areas so there's a better chance of picking up different points? Yes. Now, obviously, legally, you can only fly to 400 feet or 120 meters above the ground. But if you're having issues with it and you know that a certain photo is only going to have, say, flat ground or snow or sand or vegetation or whatever, increasing that altitude increases the field of view of the camera, helps pick up stuff outside of it. Oh man, this is a long one. All right, here we go. Is there a way to quantify or at least guesstimate how much disturbance per area, per unit area, per photo / whatever a snow surface needs to be able to be modeled coherently with photogrammetry? I've had some success walking around in a rough grid and dragging my feet to leave some shadows in the snow. Good for you. Then flying really low and slow, but I haven't tried enough site large, few acres, so I don't have a good sense for how well this approach would scale to, say, a 100-acre site with truck treads. Sorry, not good at reading today. The fact is that if you have truck treads or truck marks on the site, that job's already been kind of done. And actually, what you'd want to do, like we talked about, is increase your altitude so you're able to capture more features per photo. The dragging the feet thing is inspired. And I'm both sad that you had to go out and do it, and also a little impressed that you had the gumption to go do that. But basically, the truck tracks are doing the same thing as the drag in the feet. So again, you need to look at where your transects are going to be when you plan the mission, and then notice that, if it's flying over an area and you look at the site, if you're on site, and you notice that there's nothing in there, maybe you just drive your truck around there, do donuts, have fun with it if you can, be safe. But donuts are great. Just to mark out the area because I don't want you walking a 100-acre site. Question: Do you know anything that can make a good surface of underwater terrain for a propeller? That is going to go into the bathymetry stuff, and there is a specific type of LiDAR that is designed to penetrate water. And the way they do that is that they do something called a backscatter reflection. And so what they'll do is they'll disregard the first return, and they'll only look for returns below a certain surface level, and that's actually probably going to be the base of the water there. There are a lot of these type of LiDAR units. They usually have to be flown very low, and they're usually very expensive, but that might be one way to do it. The other way to do it is that if you're working in an area that is along the coast or public land or may have been surveyed by the government or your state GIS agency, they may already have that underwater surface available. So if you go to the state GIS department or state GIS deposits, everyone's a little different, and look for bathymetry data, they might have it there already for you. And that might be a good way to do it. The problem with editing water surface in propeller itself using the terrain cleanups is that we don't actually know how deep the water goes, so it's tough to set that reference level to like actually generate the water, the underneath water surface. How much impact do shifting shadows have on a photogrammetry surface? Not many, because usually when you're flying an area, you're flying the same area in a very short amount of time, even if you have multiple flights across the same site. Where the drone is actually flying at any given time is a very short amount of time unless you have to stop for safety or whatever. And so the shadows don't have a lot of chance to move on. To be real honest, as long as we have good registration points that aren't just shadows, we've seen data sets come in that are flown at like almost dusk. In fact, the data set comes in black and it's still able to model the terrain. I don't know how it did it, and I don't recommend that, but it did work. So I wouldn't worry too much on shifting shadows. It's really hard to say. As far as the surface goes, as long as you have other good reference points to tie into. Does avoiding low feature areas, such as body of water, improve the overall quality of the survey, or is it primarily to prevent collecting data that won't stitch together properly? It's the second one. The overall quality of survey is probably going to be fine no matter what, because we're only looking at each of those photos or LiDAR paths compared to each other, not the bigger data set, if that makes any sense, because we stitch, 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 and it's always 1-to-1, 1-to-1, 1-to-1 kind of a deal. So what you end up with is that the rest of the data set is just fine, like on that water example I showed you where it had goofy spikes and stuff, but the actual surface that you're concerned about will look weird. Can I do terrain cleanups on the web app of Propeller? Not yet, but we are we have hired a lot of people this year to work specifically on the mobile app for Propeller. And so if you have feature requests or things like that, please reach out to your CSE and let them know that that's something you want to see in the mobile app because we are actively developing it and we're looking for features to add in. Obviously, you could just say, well, add in all the features from the platform, but there's a lot of those things that don't really translate to the mobile app, so we can kind of pick and choose. But if that's something you're looking to do and you think you might get a lot of use out of it, forward that to your CSE. What depth of water does the spiking begin to occur? We've flown drained reservoirs before and encountered the spiking water only up to 1 foot deep. There is no good answer. It depends on how calm the water is, how clear the water is, how opaque the water is. I'm guessing if you flew a drained reservoir, it's a pretty opaque surface. And so it never gets below a certain amount of, or a certain distance below the water surface before it starts freaking out. That's kind of why I said, like, if you see a body of water in your data set, you want to assume that that water has problems until proven otherwise. I have a question about using aloft air control for clearance and for mission planning. That is a very specific one. I would definitely reach out to your customer success engineer or contact at Propeller with that specific question. They would look at it. Theoretically, there shouldn't be a problem with using the air control app as opposed to DJI Pilot 2, but it's better to look at it and be sure before you go out and fly it versus taking my word for it without looking at your mission or like the specific settings and things like that. The only issue we would have for dealing with PPK corrections is that we want to make sure that all the data is formatted correctly in the metadata files and that the naming scheme is consistent. And sometimes it isn't. How can snow be adjusted with LiDAR? That's a tricky one. Generally, if the snow is going to cause a problem, it's going to be a pretty uniform surface. So I would maybe look into doing the terrain cleanups in that instance to flatten out the snow surface. The other way you could do it, again, is not fly it at high noon where the sun is actually reflecting off of the snow back to the sensor, or fly it during a cloudy day would help as well. But the more of those disturbances you can get into the data set, the better. Would Siteworks work with Propeller? Trimble Siteworks, for those of you that don't know. Gonna need a little more context on that one. I'd reach out again to whoever your contact is at Propeller. In this case, this person can just call me and ask me, and we can work it out. So Siteworks does a lot, and I'm kind of not sure exactly what you're looking to get out of it with Propeller. What about a terrain cleanup that might require more triangles, i.e. a raised belt over a stockpile? Stockpile shape is somewhat reliable, but needs more triangles than a ditch bottom. You're not wrong. So the amount of triangles that the terrain cleanup uses depends on the surrounding area that it's trying to match, right? So if I'm trying to match only the bank, like I showed you on that canal, it used 2 triangles because it's supposed to be flat. If you're drawing over a stockpile and you take into account certain features outside of, say, that raised belt, what it should do is see that the stockpile surface is different from the belt and flatten the belt down to the top of the stockpile. Now, if you drew a terrain cleanup around the entire stockpile and the entire belt, it would see that the ground outside is flat and just flatten the whole thing down because it is that aggressive. But if you try to give it some context for what it's trying to match, it should do pretty well. It's worth a shot. The worst thing that happens is it doesn't work and you delete the terrain cleanup and move on. But we do have a lot of people that have conveyors, like static conveyors over their stockpiles, and they remove them with terrain cleanups. Or actually, that's a feature where the automatic filters are probably better at doing that. So that's an instance where I would look at maybe increasing your filter aggressiveness if it's not capturing that conveyor or belt over the stockpile automatically. Because what it should see is that you have, a cone-shaped stockpile and this goofy square-looking thing on top and say, that doesn't look natural, and then try to get rid of it. We've had bad experiences when processing data using the auto filters for trees and buildings. This was roughly 2 years ago. Because of this, we never filtered these items out. Have these automatic data processing filters gotten better? The answer is yes. The big thing there is that the vegetation and structures filter is extremely aggressive. And so what probably happened is that you either ended up with it flattening features you didn't want, like stockpiles or berms or things like that, or it just didn't catch the trees in the buildings, which seems more unlikely because that type of filter errs on the side of removing stuff versus leaving stuff alone. So this is part of the reason that we changed the UI for the filters, by the way, is that people were choosing really, really, really aggressive filters that they didn't need to. And they were removing data from their sites without noticing it, noticing that the top of the stockpile got clipped off. So what I normally recommend is going with the least aggressive filter you can. And then if that isn't removing enough stuff for you, then bump it up. Refiltering is a relatively easy process. You can actually request it yourself if you want to. If you go up to the question mark button in the top right of your portal and then open chat support, one of those options is actually called a refiltering request ticket. They'll ask you for a link to the site and what filter you want to put on it and why and things like that. And that usually just takes a couple hours. We don't have to reprocess the whole data set because it's done in post-processing. Will LiDAR penetrate shallow water and get a return on the ground? The answer is maybe. And when I say that, I mean that the answer is inconclusive and I can't give you like a concrete yes or no on that. How shallow is the water? How dirty is the water? Is the water rough? Is the water still? Is the water reflecting the sun off of it at the time? Stuff like that. I would assume not, unless you're dealing specifically with that bathymetric LiDAR that I talked about earlier. How can I filter out patches of grass inside of a measurement area? That's one where you probably want to use the terrain cleanup or increase the automatic filter. But what you do is if you have a patch of grass that you don't like, you just draw the terrain cleanup around it and it should flatten the whole thing down to the surrounding area like I talked about earlier. And if it's really tall grass, like I used to work in North Dakota and they had grass above my head, that equipment or vegetation filter should try to remove it to drop it down to the surrounding area. Any thoughts on flying emission really low and also high for reflective surfaces? Well, I got thoughts. Trust. The What I would say is that there wouldn't be a problem with doing it because if we have problems stitching the low photos and we don't have a problem stitching the high photos, we'll just exclude the low photos and use the high photos. Or if we can stitch the low photos together, we'll use them both. But I would say the risk is relatively low on that one. It's just whether or not the photos come out in a usable state, but then we can disregard that if they don't. Do we need to identify and apply terrain cleanups prior to using a design model to get more accurate quantities? Yes. Need is a strong word, but I would recommend doing all your terrain cleanups before you start comparing to get quantities. Because, and I've seen this before, if you're flying a lake and the lake has for some reason, like a 20-foot rise in the middle of it for no reason, that's a 20-foot rise over, say, half an acre of volume that you are now measuring against your design file, which is no bueno. So I would definitely go through and look at your problem areas before you start comparing quantities. What issues could be presented if we are surveying a small area at 50 feet AGL as opposed to 200 feet AGL? Well, the rule of thumb when flying lower is that you want to increase your overlaps in your mission settings. So if you're flying at 50 feet, you want to bump those up to like 90 to 95%, depending on what kind of drone you're flying, as opposed to 80 or 75 normally. The biggest issue is that if you don't bump up your overlaps a significant amount, you're taking the photos so far apart from each other that you're not able to find a feature in each photo stitched together. And because you're flying so low, and depending on what camera you're flying, the field of view can be drastically reduced. So for example, an M3 has a wide camera, whereas the P1 and the M300 and the M350 is a 4x3 or a 3x4. And so it's a much narrower field of view. So it's going to have more problems picking out common features between each photos unless you bump those overlaps up. What is considered the best export option for taking surfaces from Propeller into CAD? I frequently have issues with all of my triangles being wasted on the trees and on the perimeter when I try to export DXFs. And even the TTM export ended up having the exact same issue. So what I would do, there's two things I would do. The first thing I would do is that either way, you're going to end up using a custom export, which is where you draw a measurement area around and then you actually export that area as your surface. So there's two ways to go about that. The first way to go about it is to go through a terrain cleanup and remove all that vegetation that you don't want, and then do that custom export from that area. And then that'll remove all of those trees and all the triangles that are being wasted on those trees and things like that. The other option is to draw that measurement area in such a way that it excludes those areas of vegetation so that all your triangle budget is focused on the area that you're concerned about. You can do a custom export of a DXF and a TTM, so this should be just fine. The problem with the output tab and files exports is that they are done before terrain cleanups are applied, because terrain cleanups are done kind of on the fly versus being done at the time of processing like the filters are. So that's probably why you end up with a lot of junk data in your TTM if you're using that. The other problem is that export from that output and files tab always shoots for a certain number of triangles in the resulting file, usually about 250,000-ish or so. And so if you have 250,000 triangles to use and you're surveying an area of 50 acres, well, and you have groves of trees on either side, well, that's a lot of triangles being wasted on all those trees. So yeah, custom export, terrain cleanups, exclude the areas. If you're not quite sure how to do custom exports, we do have the help center, which is underneath that question mark in the top right of the portal where the chat option is. And you can just search for custom export and it'll pop up a thing on how to do that. Otherwise, you can reach out to your CSC and they can kind of help walk you through it. Is it possible to process LiDAR data through Propeller? Yes, with a caveat. Right now, we're only natively supporting the L1 and L2 sensors from DJI. Most of our customers fly DJI. They're the cheapest option, the most accessible option, and they don't generate an overwhelming amount of data like those truck-mounted ones do. But those are the options right now. If you're curious about that, talk with your CSD and their account manager. They can kind of work you through it. It does have a slightly different pricing scheme than the photogrammetry processing does. But yes, we can do it as long as it is from the L1 or L2. We can also use arrow points as our ground control in that instance, which is nice. Can we bring in LiDAR or point cloud data to merge with photogrammetry survey? That is a topical question, and it relates to the TTM surface rover survey DLE question before. We are very, very close, if not ready to do it right now, to releasing the ability to allow you to import a custom LiDAR dataset captured with whatever. So the example that we've been using is a site where they had to trench out something for a utility, and they didn't want to fly the whole thing with a drone again. So what they do is just walk around with one of those little hand scanny dealies, and then they load that point cloud in a propeller, and that pops up as like an updated surface in their existing drone survey. So very topical question. Reach out to your CSD for more information on that. What is the best drone for photogrammetry if you have no budget? Well, it's this drone. They made a lot of them back in the day, but people don't use them so much anymore. It's called a pen, and you draw out your surface. No, the real answer is it depends on what your actual budget is if you're talking about it. We have a very short list of drones for photogrammetry because we have relatively exacting specs on the camera that we require. Technically, you can use any drone for photogrammetry, but there are some pretty big drawbacks to using like an consumer drone that you get at the store or something like that, because they normally don't have the right shutter and the right GPS receivers in them. But it can be done if you're really, really strapped for budget. The real limiter there is whether the drone has the ability to plan missions or if you have to manually fly it. You can manually fly it, but man, it's not good. Will there be an option to join photogrammetry and LiDAR surveys, photogrammetry and bathymetric? Yeah, related to the one I talked about, where we're suddenly becoming a bit, we're suddenly available to import basically whatever we want, as long as it's in the right coordinate system and lines up. You just stitch it onto the existing surface. Sometimes columns, pillars, and even without any filter are not in the model at the full height, more like they're disturbed, broken in half, spiked at the top. Yeah, and so the problem with specifically vertical pillars and columns and things like that, radio antennas, cell towers have the same problem, is that as the drone flies over it, the whole thing moves, right, because of the parallax effect. And so it sees it from one angle and says, oh, it's this tall, but then it sees it from another angle and says, oh, it actually isn't that tall. And so it averages out the two, and then it starts clipping stuff off the top. If you do have features like that, columns, pillars, things like that, that's an instance where LiDAR will probably get you a more reliable return than photogrammetry. Or you can also fly those using an oblique mission where the camera is actually bent at like a 45 or a 60-degree angle, and then you can fly around the object to measure it better without just flying from a straight nadir area like that. So if you are not interested in LiDAR, check out that oblique feature, which should be a mission type in the drone controller. Within Propeller, what is the best error overall you can get from Propeller, i.e. within 2 millimeters? I know it will be depending on the drone flight. This is a tricky one because I don't like to give absolutes. The lowest error I've ever seen was 0.003 of an inch, which at that point you're starting to get into how accurate GPS can actually be. But that's the lowest error I've seen between a checkpoint and the drone surface, and that's a vertical error. And 0.003 of an inch is something in millimeters. I'm very sorry about that, but that's kind of where we're at. What is your best recommendation for flying high vegetation areas? Well, it will be kind of what I talked about. Increase your flight height, change your mission areas, try to capture features around the vegetation that we can use to stitch it together. Even something like if someone knocked down a tree and there's a bare spot, in the vegetation. That would be extremely helpful because at least we have some kind of concrete reference point there. If you have to fly a vegetated area and there is no alternative, depending on the specific area and the specific mission, you may just be stuck, unfortunately, because it might just be a world where no matter how high you fly, you're never going to see something outside of the vegetation. But you can get waivers from the government to also increase that flight height to 400, but that does require above 400 feet or 120 meters. But that does require a manual written waiver to that entity and to get them to approve that. Tips for freshly paved roadways or runways. Well, like I mentioned, that problem usually solves itself over time. But generally, the issue we have with freshly paved roadways and runways is that that's a limited area. And so if you fly missions around the outside of it, and as long as your grade is right on the outside of it, you can actually use like one of those terrain cleanups to just kind of flatten the whole thing, kind of like a water surface, where you use the surrounding areas to flatten the asphalt because it should be flattish, even if it's on a little bit of a slope. So again, try to catch features outside of it, or just wait a little bit and have someone drive trucks over it for fun. Is mission planning going to be an option through Propeller in the near future? It's something we've kicked around. I can't give anything concrete. I don't think it's on the roadmap at all. We've had a few people request it. One of the issues is that we don't want to get too stretched out on too many different things. Right now our big initiative is on making Propeller as kind of the center of your data hubs and geospatial stuff. If we start doing flight planning, that takes away from that. So it's just a question of priority of resources. But if you do have a request for that, definitely send it into your CSE and it will get added to the future request list. What is the best elevation to fly a site? Depends on the site. I normally recommend flying a site at about 300 to 350 to 400 feet. If you're looking for really detailed photos and very, very small details on the ground, then you want to drop that elevation. But that is going to exponentially increase the number of photos you take, and that can either end up burning you a lot of credits that you don't need to burn, or you just can't upload under an unlimited license because it's over the gigapixel. Can you apply a filter after initial processing? Yes. Like I said, if you go up into the question mark in the top right and go to chat support, there's an option there that says submit refilter ticket request, refilter request ticket, something like that. It has the words refilter and ticket in it. And then you can ask what type of filter you want to put on the data set. Not related directly to this webinar, but is there a way around the 30 most recent survey limit for the WMTS connection? Would hosting the data on our own Azure have any effect? The first answer is not really, but it is something that we are working on actively to increase the number of surveys available in WMTS. That's a very limiting factor. And I know, my background's GIS, so if I only had the 30 surveys in my GIS, I'd be pretty salty about it. I don't think hosting on your own Azure would have any. Well, that would definitely fix the problem, actually, because then you could just pull the file straight in from Azure, but you got to set up that whole link and things like that. But reach out to your CSE about that one. Can Propeller process in-star data? I'm going to say no off the top of my head because I'm not entirely sure what that is, to be real honest. So that is that's a question to reach out to your CSE for. I mentioned oblique for LiDAR. Does Propeller process oblique photogrammetry to help get under tree canopies and etc.? Yes, getting under tree canopies with oblique photogrammetry is really hard though, because you have to fly really low to do it. And what you end up with is a lot of conflicting data and a very noisy and messy point cloud because the tree canopy will confuse them a little bit. Normally, when I recommend flying oblique missions is for flying vertical faces and things like that. So cliff walls, buildings, retaining walls, stuff like that. You can give her a shot. Worst thing that happens is it doesn't work. Just please don't crash your drone into the trees because you have to fly so low. Ah, 3/3000th of an inch is 0.0762 millimeters, which doesn't sound like a real number. Thank you, Chuck. Can you explain the difference between terrain cleanup and filter? Sometimes all the flights look great, except for one small unfortunate feature. Is it important to unclean up a small area? So the filters are automatically applied to the whole data set at the time of processing or when every filter request is submitted. So they're applied to the whole data set. They're an automatic process. They just look for features that violate a certain algorithm rule and say, all right, this thing has an angle of X over X. That's not good, or remove it. Generally, if you're ending up with issues where the automatic filters are removing stuff that you want to see, that's an instance where you want to back down on the filter and then maybe go in and do the cleanups yourself. Will new concrete pads give the same issue as asphalt? It's not as bad with concrete pads because concrete pads usually have like the expansion joints in them, and we can use that. The other problem is that because that fresh asphalt is so black, it's really hard to see the actual ground surface on it. Asphalt doesn't usually, or concrete pads don't usually have the same problem because they're either a gray or they have aggregates in them or something like that that breaks up the surface. If you were seeking out a waiver to fly higher to try to deal with a heavily vegetated area, is there a point of diminishing returns where the increasing GSD/decreasing detail per photo makes it harder to find key points? Yes, but with a pretty big asterisk. And that's an instance where if you're flying at 800 feet with a 20 megapixel camera, yeah, you're going to end up with some problems unless the feature is very, very distinct. Corner of a building, corner of a lot, an arrow point, target, stuff like that. That's an instance where you may want to, if you do have to fly at 800 feet or 1,000 feet or something like that, first of all, get the waiver first before you ask or before you do it. Second of all, consider bumping up the camera to a higher megapixel or a better zoom camera. So for instance, the M3E is really great at capturing a wide area in a few amount of shots, but the P1 is twice the megapixels and it has a much narrower field of view, so it's better at picking out those kind of features from altitude. Why can't I add simple CSV files of survey data? Importing points via land XML doesn't work well. That is a great question. And we on the go-to-market side are pushing heavily for that feature to be added. We've had multiple requests for it for years. Trust me, I am in your corner on this one, and we are pushing hard for that to be added relatively soon here. What is the name of the office dog? Well, there's actually two dogs. The dog you see right now is Cleo. She's great. And if you saw a little brown dog running around, that is Clover. And she is also great, just like all dogs. What is the best time of day to fly a racket? Never, because you don't want to attract the birds. Also, a racket isn't real, and it's important to me that you know that. Okay, last one. I had someone ask me about DirtMate here because I have a little unit right here. DirtMate is basically Propeller's machine-mounted tracking solution. So what you do is you take one of these little guys, you put it on the top of your dozer, cab, or a scraper, water truck, whatever. And then based on the GPS unit in here and the IMU in it, it'll actually measure the surface as the piece of equipment drives over the area. So what it'll do is it'll actually update the surface in real time as the equipment drives over it. So every time a scraper drives over an area, you get an updated surface giving you your elevation, how close you are to grade, things like that. The other thing we're exploring with DerMate is because this is a GPS unit, a pretty accurate GPS unit, we're looking at expanding this out into like a low-cost rover situation. It's never going to replace a total station, but those stations also cost 60 grand, right? This does not. So for that reason, we put a 5/8 inch thread on the bottom so you can actually mount it on a rod. And we are going to be looking at that as kind of an H2 initiative to expand the use of this thing. But right now, it's fleet tracking, surface tracking. It also tells you when the trucks are running and when they're not trucking or not running, depending on how much motion it's detecting through the IMU. How fast they're going, if they're going over 45 miles an hour, shredding their tires, stuff like that. So just basically a good way to get live data feeds on your equipment on site. If you do have questions about DirtMate, 100% reach out to your CSE. We are making DirtMate a major initiative this year, and so we are looking to expand our DirtMate usage across our customers. I can't give exact details on how much this costs because I'm bad at money and they don't want me talking money. But it is, I can't even really give a range. Let's say under 4,000 for one of these things, if we're going to be using it as a rover. But if you're using it for tracking machines, the pricing is different, and that's an instance where we actually have to talk to one of the salespeople because they know stuff and I don't, and I'm not good at talking money, and they are. So That is the Propeller Power Hour for today. Once again, I thank everyone for showing up. I appreciate your time. I'm glad you were here. I appreciated all of the questions available. If you do have any additional questions, or you had a question that wasn't answered, we will be reaching out to those people, or just reach out to your CSD. That's what they're there for. That's why they get paid. And I'm sure I have a bunch of missing phone calls from doing this hour. Again, thanks everyone. See you next time.